Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today, on September 19th, 2022, I'm excited to be talking about one of my favorite Americans of all time, Frederick Douglass. I'm even more excited to welcome back Timothy Sandefur, who wrote the book Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man. He's also the Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Goldwater Institute. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
So, before we jump in, I've asked you this question before, but what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
So this is a hard question in part because I think people assume that you get wiser as you get older. I'm only 45, so I'm not exactly old, but I am old enough now to realize, I think, that you don't actually become wiser as you get older. Instead, what you get is a sense of proportion. So the reason why a little child stubs his foot and cries just really loudly when he stubs his foot is because, honestly, that's one of the worst things that's ever happened to him in his entire life, right? Or the reason why a child looks forward so much, when you say Christmas is only a few months away, to him that feels like forever because it's like a fifth of his entire life, right? That's a huge amount of time. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you get to being 45, Christmas being a year away, that's only 1/45th of my life. Well, the same thing happens with emotional trauma or intellectual discovery or all those sorts of things is over time, you get more of a sense of proportion of whether something or other is really a big deal or not. And it's also something that you really can't communicate to other people, this sense of proportion. It's more like being on a train and you're going past trees. And as the tree approaches you, you see one side of the tree. And then as you get past the tree, you see the other side of the tree. But people farther back on the train, they still don't see the other side of the tree. They still only see the first side of the tree. Getting older is kind of like that. So what I would say to younger people is when you feel like something is the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, it's impossible to really have a grasp of how important, how significant, how big a deal that thing truly is. You know, your first love, your first real fight with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, things like that might seem like huge deals, but over the scheme of things, you discover that they weren't as big a deal as you thought they were. That's something that, as I said before, cannot be communicated to somebody, so you can't really learn it when you're young, but it's something to keep in mind whenever you encounter something that looks like a big deal in your life, is realize that it might not be as big a deal as you think it is. And the best way to address that is to talk to other people who have been through similar situations and try and put things in the scheme of proportion in your life. You know, even if it's a personal trauma or if it's like a political thing, like a big controversy that's going on at the time or something, you know, talk to people who have been through some similar thing and see if you really should feel as devastated or enthusiastic about that thing as you actually are. That's a long-winded answer, but I think that's probably the best that I can do.
And that's some great advice. I think it's kind of interesting to hear that now, because I know that if I had heard it when I was 10, say, I wouldn't have been able to understand it. But enough time has passed that I've seen this at least a little bit in my life. But I know it's some good advice going forward because I can grasp what you mean because I've seen it. But yep. It's just going to keep happening.
That's right. And there's a passage in Nietzsche about this where he says, when you're in your, I'm paraphrasing, of course, he says, when you're in your 20s, everything is either yes or no or good or bad. And then when you get into your 30s, you realize that was just youth. And you have so much contempt for youth and you want to be as unlike your youth as you could possibly be. And then when you get into your 40s, you realize that attitude also was only youth. In other words, as you become in your 20s and 30s, you get to the point where you have sort of contempt for the teenage you because you realize how naive you were. And then as you get even older, you realize that even that was kind of a silly approach, that it's okay for everything to have its season and to try and be forgiving toward yourself for being human is really a good thing to cultivate.
On that note, let's talk about Frederick Douglass. So first, I guess, where did the philosophy that underpinned slavery, the idea that it was okay to own another person, where did that come from?
Well,
jumping in deep.
Yeah, human history could basically be written as a history of slavery, because slavery is pervasive throughout all human history and in virtually every culture. Certainly every culture I've ever heard of has some kind of thing like slavery in its past. And it was only in the past 2 centuries or so that people realized that this was evil and ought to be abolished. That's a blip on the scale when you talk about the scope of human history. And it was traditionally done in forms of, well, these people aren't members of my tribe, so therefore I can subdue them, and I defeated them in war, so therefore they belong to me, and that sort of thing. And that the modern chattel slavery attitudes that we are familiar with from American history, that really only developed starting between about 1800 and 1830 or so. Beginning in the 1830s, you had what was called the positive goods school of slavery, which was the idea that slavery was a good thing for society and civilization. And it could point back to history and point back to the Romans and the Greeks and all the rest and say, look, they all had slavery and all this sort of thing. But what made this attitude distinct was that it was the first anti-capitalist ideology in world history, really, certainly in American history. And this was developed in reaction against the rising tide of the Industrial Revolution in capitalism in Europe and a little bit in America. And Southerners started looking at capitalism and saying, this is terrible because it's all just a bunch of people who agree based on contract, and it's all based on rationality and self-interest, and those are bad things. What we ought to have instead is communitarian society where everybody knows where they belong, everybody fills a social role, everybody has this sense of community and belonging, and isn't that great? Everybody is in harmony and all this sort of thing, which of course was crap because it was based on subjugation and brutality and discrimination and so forth. But whenever they were challenged on this, the Southern pro-slavery side would point to Europe and say, look at how the workers there are treated. Why, they don't even have a roof over their heads, and they go from one job to the other and all this sort of thing. And whereas we take care of slaves, we provide them with a sense of belonging, and we provide them with all the things that they need for a life and all this sort of stuff. So it was the first communitarian anti-capitalist ideology. You really find this in the works of George Fitzhugh, who was a Virginia pro-slavery writer who more or less invented the word sociology. Sociology was that was the title of one of his books, was supposed to be the alternative to political economy. Political economy is the view of society in terms of capitalism, Adam Smith, that sort of thing. And as a reaction against that, you have sociology. Sociology is concerned with social ties between individuals and a sense of belonging and so forth. And that's why Fitzhugh then concluded that slavery was the perfect form of socialism. That was his words, and accurate words. So that's where the ideology of slavery comes from. It's rooted in history, but it really makes its modern form as a reaction against capitalism beginning around 1800, 1830.
In your book, you wrote that the denial of, quote, history, the law, and the fruits of their labor, end quote, was the way that the institution of slavery was maintained. Can you explain the importance of each one and how it was done?
History, law, and what was the third one?
The fruits of their labor.
Yeah, that's right.
Capitalism part.
Yeah. So that's how to put this. So people, in order to feel a sense of self, I think what they need to feel is they need to have a sense that their work accomplishes something in the real world, a sense of efficacy. And the way we largely do that is with the fruits of our labor, with the accomplishments, whether they're tangible or intangible, that we've made in our lives. And that means investing yourself in something that means something to you and then producing something out of that. And whether that's going to a job and getting a paycheck and spending that paycheck on your family, or whether it's, maybe you're an artist and you spend time painting a beautiful painting and now you have that beautiful painting and you consider that the fruits of your labor. Whatever it is, we need to project ourselves into the world through our labors and to have the consequences of that belong to us to help give us a sense of self. Slavery took that away by forcing the slave to labor for the master and depriving the slave of any property rights, so that the slave could have no sense of what he or she owned or created in the world. And that's why even things that didn't really matter that much in terms of like financial benefit were taken away from slaves. They weren't allowed to really have any sense of themselves as efficacious beings in the world, to break down a sense of pride, which of course is anathema to slavery. Law is another way that this is done. Law is a system of regular rules that govern our behaviors so that we can predict the future and so that we can make plans for ourselves and know how to relate to one another. The opposite of law is arbitrary rule, where you are controlled by some other person who just dictates to you based on that person's own desires and wishes, and your desires and wishes mean nothing because you can't accomplish them. Law, sometimes we have this idea that law consists of a command from the government to us, and that's absolutely not what law is. Law is a system of rules that allows us to accomplish our own goals vis-a-vis other people. And so taking that away from slaves and subjecting them to a lawless rule of arbitrariness was really essential to breaking down their sense of self. And another really important aspect of the sense of self that gives us a sense of personal identity is our relationship to history, how we relate to the past, how we relate to our families, how we relate to the nation, how we relate to the world. We all have a sense of participating in some kind of a story that helps explain where we come from and where we're going. Maybe some people put that in terms of genealogy, like where their family comes from. Maybe some people put that in terms of an ideology. Maybe they belong to a cause and they really see themselves as taking the steps that the previous generations set in store for them. Maybe it's a religious thing and they see themselves as part of, the Judeo-Christian or the Islamic movement throughout world history and the manifestation of God's will or something like that. There's always some kind of sense of relationship to a story. But taking that away from a slave renders the slave, basically like a person who's, sensory deprived, unable to feel their way throughout the world of human existence. And so that's why I say in the book that slave masters took history, law, and the fruits of their labor away from slaves to break down a sense of self, a sense of who they were as individuals. And this happened to Douglass. He tells us in his autobiography that he was so severely abused by Edward Covey, the slave breaker, in these ways that the horizon of his life shrank down to a single point, and his will was broken, and he felt himself, his sense of selfness being absolutely destroyed. It's a quality that's hard to explain and hard to even understand to those of us who, thank God, have never experienced it. But it's more beyond cruelty. It's an ideological eradication of the self that I'm trying to describe.
And I want to talk about these two moments in Douglass's early life before he escapes and is freed that I think really are two of the most defining moments in who he becomes. And the first one is when he learns to read. Can you tell us a bit about that and his early life?
Yes. So Douglass was born in Maryland, and at the age of 7, he was separated from his family and sent to live with the Auld family, particularly to be a playmate for the young child of Sophia Auld, who was the wife of his master. And Sophia was, Douglass tells us, was very inexperienced as a slave owner. She hadn't had that situation before, so she didn't know the rules, the unwritten rules of how to be a slave mistress. And one of those being that you don't teach slaves to read, because if they start to read, then they'll start to get ideas and they'll start to want to run away. And you don't want to have that, so you don't let them read. So she, out of the goodness of her heart, she tried to teach young Frederick how to read the Bible. And when her husband, Hugh Auld, discovered this, he was horrified. And he said, if you teach him to read, he's going to start having ideas, and you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. And so as soon as Douglass heard that, he tells us it was the first abolitionist speech he ever heard, he says. In other words, he realized immediately that what Hugh was saying was that he needs to learn to read if he wants to be free. So he tricked the neighborhood boys into teaching him how to read and write by saying, I bet you don't know your alphabet. And they would say, yes, we do. And they would show him, and then he would practice the alphabet. And then he would pick up newspapers from the streets, where they'd been thrown away and this sort of thing in order to practice reading. And reading, of course, as is always the case, it opened these immense horizons to him. He could read and discover the ideas of generations of past thinkers, as well as the abolitionists who were starting their movement at just that time. This is in the 1830s or so. So reading was a huge open door for Douglas, as it has been for so many other people since.
And what was so fascinating to me about his autobiography is how he talks about after that initial moment where Sophia realizes that she shouldn't do that anymore, she gets, I don't know if I should say worse, but she kind of turns into what a slave mistress should be.
Yes.
She's just like dehumanizing. He has a quote in there that reads, "We were both victims of the same overshadowing evil. She is mistress, me as slave," end quote. What's your take on that?
I think it's just a marvelous observation on his part. It would be very easy to only see slavery in terms of how it affected him personally, and he doesn't do that. He stops and he says slavery also really wrecked the character of a lot of white people. It rewarded them for their worst instincts and punished them for their best instincts. Here we have a woman who's doing what is a natural and beautiful thing, which is teaching a young child, really, he effectively had no parents at that point, and she's, being a mother figure to him. And how sweet could that possibly be? And yet she gets punished. Her husband gets angry at her for it. And so as a result, she turns around and it distorts her personality just as it was warping his own experience as a child. So it's a marvelous insight into the fact that slavery perverted not just ruined the lives of a lot of Black people, but also perverted the characters of a lot of white people.
So we have this freedom of the mind. He has the quote book learning, as he calls it. But he's still a slave in body, in the physical world at this point. And then he's sent to Edward Covey, who all but kills him, and uses all these methods you were talking about earlier of maintaining this system. Can you tell us the key points of their relationship and what that did to him and how he dealt with that?
Yeah, so Douglas leaves Hugh Auld's household and is sent to live with Thomas Auld, who is really a stingy and cruel person, and keeps Douglas hungry and won't let him read and all these sorts of things. And Douglas is a teenager at this point, and all teenagers are rebellious, but particularly if you're abusing them in this way and they have just cause. So Douglas becomes very rebellious against Thomas Auld. So Auld says, well, I'll teach you a lesson, and sends him to Edward Covey, because Covey has this reputation for his skill at breaking the will of rebellious slaves. And so Covey has a regimen on his farm where he beats Douglas at least once a week for something, finds some excuse, right? And he assigns Douglas to these tasks that cannot possibly be accomplished, and then punishes him for failing them, and these sorts of things. And finally, on one particular day, Douglas suffers a heat stroke. He's out in the field and he suffers heat stroke, and Covey hits him, starts to beat him with a stick for having sat down instead of continuing his work. And Douglas decides he's got to ask for help. So he walks away from the plantation, walks 2 miles to Thomas Auld's house to beg him for mercy. And Covey lets him go. He's like, fine, you think you can do that? You go ahead and see what happens. So Douglas goes and begs for help, and Auld sends him back to Covey's farm. And Douglas goes back, and of course Covey starts to beat him again. And Douglas is at his lowest possible point. And somehow, he writes in his memoir, somehow he finds the strength in him to resist, and he holds back and he fights back Covey. Now, there's one part that I'm not really sure I quite buy. Douglas claims that he didn't hit Covey, but that he just held him back and fended off Covey's blows. I find that a little hard to believe. But at one point, Douglas grabs Covey by the throat and held him there and tried to hold him at arm's length to keep him away from himself. And finally, after fighting for a long time, Covey wanders off, basically gives up. And Douglas has managed to succeed. He has not been hit in this struggle. And he tells us that this was the moment he realized the lesson of his life, which was whoever would be free must himself strike the blow, which is a quotation from the poet Byron, which Douglas took as basically his personal motto. So that's what he learned from that experience. Was he was brought to his lowest moment, and he found the strength in him to build himself back up again. And it began with this little spark of saying no to Edward Covey rather than allowing himself to be extinguished.
And then Douglas escapes. How does that happen?
Douglas got a pass, a forged Navy pass, and then disguised himself as a sailor. He had gone back to living in Baltimore, so he was about 20 years old by this time. He disguised himself as a sailor and used these fake papers to escape on the Underground Railroad. That's the common term for it, but he was actually on a railroad when he did it. He got on the train and managed to sneak past the conductor with his forged papers. And then he went from there to New York City, and in New York City met up with some abolitionists who sent him to live in New Bedford, Massachusetts, because Douglas, by that time, he had some experience building ships. So New Bedford, Massachusetts was the home of the nation's whaling industry, which was, that's where Herman Melville was and so forth. So Douglas thought he could get some work on the ships. He ended up not working at the shipyard for very long because the other white workers wouldn't work with him. And so he ended up doing a variety of other odd jobs. But that's how he escaped, was with these papers that allowed him to escape on the Underground Railroad. And in the first two editions of his memoir, he was very careful not to give any kind of details about that because he didn't want to ruin the opportunity of other slaves to escape. He wrote his third edition 30 years after the war. He was able to be more open about what exactly he did.
And while that part of his life is so fascinating and so inspiring, right? Human perseverance, optimism, this system that basically just sets the entire world up against you, and he still wins. That's great. And it's important to know where he came from and that that happened. But then he gets into this ideas abolitionism space. And to me, that's almost more fascinating because he takes what he learned and what happened to him and flips it on its head. And it starts with the Garrisonians. So who were they and who was William Lloyd Garrison?
William Lloyd Garrison was the foremost abolitionist of his day. We're talking about the early 1830s. In 1831, he started publishing a newspaper called The Liberator, which became the standard abolitionist newspaper. Now, quickly about terminology. So people sometimes use the word abolitionist to refer to anybody who's anti-slavery, and that's not accurate. Anti-slavery had different varieties. The first variety was colonization. The idea of colonization began sometime in the 1780s or something like that. And it was the idea that slaves should be gradually freed and then they and their descendants should be shipped to Africa or Central America to form colonies there. And the theory behind this was that whites and blacks could never get along together in America alongside each other, so they had to separate. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe, they were all members of this group of anti-slavery thinkers. Abolitionism comes along in the 1830s. It's basically founded by a guy named Benjamin Lundy, who was an anti-slavery activist who was the teacher of William Lloyd Garrison. And they and a few others start abolition. Abolitionism is basically three things. It means immediate end of slavery, not gradual. No compensation to slave owners, the idea being that if anybody's owed compensation, it's the slaves themselves. And no colonization, no shipping anybody anywhere. Blacks and whites should live together in North America. And Garrison becomes the leader of that group, and he's based out of Massachusetts. But Garrison also believes in a lot of other pretty wacky ideas. For example, he thinks that the northern states should secede from the Union in order to have nothing to do with slavery. And he's opposed to any kind of political involvement because he thinks the Constitution is evil for protecting slavery. Therefore, you shouldn't vote, you shouldn't run for office, you shouldn't have anything to do with the state because it lends your moral credibility to the evil state. And at first, Douglas is attracted to this idea. But then over the years, he starts to say, well, wait a minute, we should participate in politics. If we can elect anti-slavery congressmen, we ought to try that. The Constitution actually does give Congress power to restrict and possibly even abolish slavery. So we ought to take advantage of that opportunity. So beginning in the late 1840s, early 1850s, Douglas changes his mind and gradually becomes a pro-Constitution abolitionist, whereas Garrison is an anti-Constitution abolitionist. And they have a personal quarrel over this and other things, and they ended up, not being friends anymore, which is really kind of tragic. But, in the end, I think Douglas had a lot more influence on the course of American constitutional development than Garrison did, because Garrison was anti-Constitution from the outset.
So this pro-Constitution abolitionism defends the Constitution as an anti-slavery document.
Right.
What is that? What are the arguments for that? What is Douglas's take on that?
So the argument goes this way. First, whenever you're interpreting the Constitution, you have to have a theory of interpretation. So the anti-slavery constitutionalists, they started this way. They say, okay, we have two rules of interpretation. One is only the words of the Constitution are the law, not the subjective personal intentions of the people who wrote it. If the people who wrote it wanted it to be a pro-slavery constitution, but did not say so in the document, then it is not a pro-slavery constitution. Instead, what we have to focus on is the words alone, because that's what the people ratified when they ratified the Constitution was just the words. And our second rule of interpretation is if it's possible to find a pro-freedom interpretation of the words, you ought to do so, even if it's a bit of a stretch. And they got that rule from a Supreme Court opinion that Chief Justice John Marshall wrote, who said we should construe the Constitution as pro-freedom whenever possible. Now, if you look at the Constitution with those two rules in mind, where does it protect slavery? It doesn't. In fact, the word slave and the word slavery does not appear anywhere in the Constitution of the United States. So that immediately should put us on our guard. Douglas says it's kind of like having a property deed that makes no mention of the location of the property, right? That would be a little weird. So it's weird to say the Constitution is pro-slavery since it doesn't ever use the words and doesn't ever mention slavery explicitly. But there are provisions that obliquely protect slavery, or at least refer to slavery. There's the 3/5 clause. There's the importation-exportation clause, which is the clause that allows the slave trade to continue until 1808. And then there's another provision that says you can't amend that 1808 deadline. And then there's the fugitive slave clause that says that if a person escapes from one state into another state where he's bound to service or labor, that the other state must return him. Okay, so those are our pro-slavery provisions. Can we find pro-freedom interpretations of those provisions? Douglas says yes. For example, the fugitive slave clause, again, it doesn't use the word slave at all. It refers to people from whom labor is due. But Douglas says labor is not due from a slave because a slave is a victim of an injustice, and no labor is due from him. He hasn't been given due process of law, so no labor is due from him. Instead, this clause refers to indentured servants or apprentices who have run away from their masters, which, to be fair, was a serious problem in 19th century America. These apprentices would work just a little bit, and then they would run off and start their own shop, and that created a real economic problem. So there's our pro-freedom interpretation of that clause. What about the 3/5 clause? Well, again, it doesn't protect slavery. It recognized that slavery existed in some states, but it did not guarantee it. In fact, it rewarded states that abolished slavery because if they had done so, they would have gotten more representation in Congress for doing so. And then the importation-exportation clause actually does allow Congress to abolish the slave trade in 1808, which it promptly did as soon as it was able to do so. So Douglas says if you look at those allegedly pro-slavery provisions aren't actually pro-slavery. And then he says, and also slavery conflicts with a lot of provisions of the Constitution, like the due process clause that says you can't be deprived of liberty without due process of law. Slaves haven't been given due process of law. Or the Bill of Attainder clause. Slavery is kind of like a Bill of Attainder, and this takes away that freedom. Or the Fourth Amendment says that you have a right to be secure in your persons and that shall not be abridged. Yet obviously slavery is contradictory to that. And then the most important clause, which is the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 4th article of the Constitution. This says that a citizen of that when you travel from one state to another, that each state has to protect the rights of that you have as a citizen of the several states. So what does it mean to be a citizen of the several states? That language in Article 4 of the Constitution implies that there are two kinds of citizenship for American citizens. There's your citizenship in your state, and there's your federal citizenship. Now, you and I are familiar with this idea because that's the way it's been since the Civil War, because we have the 14th Amendment, and it says so. But we're talking about before the Civil War, we're talking about before the 14th Amendment. The Constitution actually never defines what the word citizen means, which is amazing if you think about it. I mean, you have a constitution of a government that doesn't say who citizens are. Instead, before the Civil War, the way that was dealt with was if you were a citizen of a state, then you were presumed to be a citizen of the United States. But that creates a real problem because a free black man could be a citizen of Massachusetts, but could not be a citizen of South Carolina. So if you travel, if you're a black man in Massachusetts and, for instance, you get on a ship and you sail down to South Carolina, are you no longer a citizen of the United States? That's what South Carolina said. And they passed a law that would throw you in jail if you showed up, because free blacks sailors were required to be thrown in jail when their ships landed in Charleston Harbor, which is crazy. It violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Constitution. And Massachusetts said this is a real problem. It was such a big problem that they sent an ambassador named George Hoare to South Carolina to negotiate and find a solution to this problem. And the state legislature of South Carolina threw him out of the state without even having a meeting with him, ordered him to leave. So those sorts of tensions obviously built into what became the Civil War. But the bottom line is you can see that there are how this argument works for an anti-slavery constitutionalism. The bottom line is that the Constitution is not a slavery document because it doesn't protect slavery. And it's even anti-slavery in its tendencies, in that it gives Congress the powers necessary to abolish slavery if it wants to, if it has the political will to do so. And it contains provisions that in the long run are incompatible with slavery, like the Due Process Clause or the Privileges and Immunities Clause.
So there are a lot of takes on this. There's a 14th Amendment documentary produced by Will Smith, kind of cool. And it really pitches Douglas as a guy that believes that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. And I asked Professor Randy Barnett at Georgetown, who I've had on the podcast, go listen to it, if he believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and he said no. And Douglas, in his later life, said that the Constitution included protections for both freedom and slavery. He wrote, quote, "Liberty and slavery, opposite as heaven and hell, are both in the Constitution. And the oath to support the latter is an oath to perform that which God has made impossible," end quote. So what do you think? Is the Constitution anti-slavery, pro-slavery, kind of this mix of both that Douglas later talks about?
It is a mix of both, but the question when you use the phrase anti-slavery document, what I think is meant by that, and what Douglas meant by that, was not that it necessarily outlawed slavery right away, although there were some people who argued that, Lysander Spooner and Joel Tiffany, for example. Let me pause here to say, what does it mean for something to be outlawed? When you say, for example, let's take the Supreme Court decision in Lawrence versus Texas, which was about 20 years ago, and the Supreme Court said that it violates the 14th Amendment for the state to arrest people for having sex in ways that the government disapproves of. The Supreme Court said that violates the Due Process Clause, which guarantees that you have the right to liberty and it will not be taken away except through due process of law. That means that it can't just be taken away arbitrarily because the government feels like it. Okay, so I take it that decision was correct. And yet, before that decision came out, many states had laws on like this on the books, and the Supreme Court itself had said they were okay. So if we agree that it's not okay, does that mean that it just became not okay in 2005? Or was it never okay? I think the better answer is that it was never okay, and that the Supreme Court saying that it was okay back in the 1980s was wrong. It was, and that's what, in fact, the Lawrence versus Texas case actually says, is that that earlier decision was wrong when it was decided. And I think that's right. And so that means that it was always illegal. It's just we didn't discover it, or we didn't really grasp its illegality until a late date. If that's what we mean by illegal, then slavery was illegal even in the 1830s, according to the logic of the argument that I've said. And that's not really a surprising conclusion, because it's inherent in the logic of the law that it's illegal to deprive, for example, a person of liberty without due process of law, as slavery did. Now, the problem is that at some point that argument gets so abstract that it's very hard to grasp, and there are counter arguments that are of equal weight. And that's the moment when you really need a constitutional amendment to clarify. So the people who wrote the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments at the end of the Civil War, they did not think of themselves as changing the law so much as clarifying the way the law already had been from the beginning, except that it had been perverted by pro-slavery thinkers. For the 14th Amendment, for instance, says, you're a citizen of the United States if you're born here, and no state can take away your freedoms. The people who wrote that thought that had always been the law, and that people like the pro-slavery Chief Justice Roger Taney had perverted the Constitution, rather, when they said that that wasn't the case. So they didn't think they were taking something that was illegal and making it legal, or vice versa. They thought they were brushing off the wrong interpretations of what the law had always been. And if that's your understanding of what it means for something to be illegal, then Douglas was right that the Constitution made slavery illegal. But there's another sense in which you can take the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, and that's the way Lincoln took it. Lincoln said, of course, slavery is in the Constitution, referred to in the Constitution, and he said it even prohibits the federal government from interfering with slavery in the states where it already exists. And so he was not, in that sense, an abolitionist. But he said that the Constitution does allow Congress to take steps to prevent its spread and gradually to lead to its eradication. As he put it, it puts slavery in the course of ultimate extinction, which is a beautiful phrase. That's what it means for the Constitution to be an anti-slavery document in Lincoln's version. So in either Douglas's or Lincoln's version, I think that, yes, the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. And those arguments, even if you don't buy that, you have to admit that both of those arguments are better than the pro-slavery argument that says that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, which it very clearly is not. If it were a pro-slavery document, it would include the word slavery somewhere in it. The fact that it does not do that, and that its authors acknowledged at the time that slavery was incompatible with what they were doing, including James Madison, who said at the Constitutional Convention that it would be wrong for the document to include any reference to the principle that a person could own another person, means that the pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution is absolutely wrong. It was wrong when Roger Taney said it. It was wrong when William Lloyd Garrison said it, and it's wrong when the 1619 Project says it today.
So recently, my mom and my sister went to see the musical American Prophet, Frederick Douglass in his own words, where basically they use quotes from his speeches and writings and all that to depict this picture of him. And afterwards, my mom called me and she was like, wow, they really made it seem like Frederick Douglass hated the United States. And I was like, what? And she was like, what? I don't know. What do we make of this, of how it was depicted? Did he hate the United States? Is that us glamorizing Frederick Douglass to make him more acceptable, or is that the playwrights making him more aggressive than he was?
Boy, that's a great question. First of all, that's a question that you could spend a whole podcast on, probably. Secondly, I should say I have not seen the musical, so I can't speak to the musical itself. But I will say, at different times in his life, Douglass both hated and loved the United States. As a young man, as a Garrisonian, when he thought that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, he hated the United States, and he said so. He said he gave one marvelous speech where he said, of course, he gave many marvelous speeches, but he gave a famous speech where he said that when he thought about the beauty of the country, he was sometimes moved, and then he would stop and he would think about the way that her beautiful rivers carry the tears of his brothers and sisters to the sea, and so forth and so on, that he was filled with unutterable loathing for America. Well, how can you blame him? And in fact, Douglas, I was asked a while back whether Douglas was a patriot. And I'm not really sure that it's fair to say that even the later Douglas was really a patriot in the sense of loving America sort of in the raw attitude that we take today and patriotic displays and so forth. Douglas had a great love for what he considered to be the heart and soul of America, which was the Declaration of Independence and the principle that all men are created equal and that all people are entitled to liberty. But he also acknowledged how hypocritical the country had been for such a long time and still was toward the end of his life. And in fact, he was rather pessimistic toward the end of his life. I would say that Douglas, here's another important point. Douglas, during the war, Douglas recruited black soldiers to join the military. And he wrote this very interesting article about why you should join the military, addressed to escaped slaves and to freedmen. And he said he gave all sorts of reasons, like a dozen different reasons. What's interesting is that what's not on the list, nowhere on the list does Douglas suggest that a black person owes a duty to fight for his country. And the reason why is because such an idea would have struck Douglas as absurd. It was not their country in the sense that it was a white person's country. The country had done horrible things to them, and they owed no sacrifice to America. It was the country that owed them, and it owed them the chance to serve in the military, to hold guns in their hands, to fight for their liberty, to prove themselves on the battlefield, to prove that they were citizens and so forth. That was Douglas's approach. Whether you regard that as loving or hating America, I think kind of depends on your own attitudes. I see it as loving America, but loving her at her best, while recognizing that she was capable of some really terrible things. And I think that that's what a thoughtful patriot is like.
That's an awesome response. This has been lovely, but we only have time for one more question. So what was one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Well, this fits actually perfectly well with the Douglas conversation. There was a time when I was very young when I believed that the Southern argument for secession was correct. I had early on read Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, and I had read a little bit about Confederate ideology, and I thought that, well, yeah, of course a state has the right to secede from the Union. The Constitution is basically a treaty among sovereign states. So if they leave, then they should be able to. Or like in the, what's that Ted Turner movie about Gettysburg, where they're sitting around the campfire and they're talking about it. And one of the Southerners says, well, yeah, it's like a club. If you join the club, then you should have the right to leave the club for any reason at all. And I thought that the Constitution was like that. And in fact, it's not. The Constitution is definitely not a treaty among sovereign states. The Constitution binds the people of the United States and then separates sovereignty in a very unique way, so that I am a citizen of both the federal government and the states separately, and and they can't interfere with each other within their legitimate boundaries. Something I only really understood later on. So there was a time when you could say I was kind of like a Confederate, and now I'm obviously and emphatically the opposite of that.
Thank you so much for sharing. This has been awesome. I've learned a ton, and I know my listeners have as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.